Now we're going to be talking about exposure. Now exposure is quite simple. It's the brightness level or the darkness level of your final picture. And it's important to get that exposure, brightness level or darkness level, absolutely correct, because that is what's most pleasing to look at in the final photographs. Now, there are two main mechanical controls in your camera, as we know, which are the aperture and the shutter, and they serve to control exposure. The aperture controls exposure by enlarging or reducing the size of the hole to let the amount of light through, and the shutter opens and closes to control the amount of time that the light is allowed through, and both of those work together to control exposure. Now, I'm just going to do some shots in manual on the camera, controlling the shutter speed manually to get the right exposure. And there we go. Using the camera in manual, we can see there that using the screen on the back as a preview, we can actually check the exposure is correct. So this is a great tool for checking the exposure, whether you've got the brightness level too much or whether you've got the picture too dark. So I'll do another example now where I actually increase the shutter speed to a faster shutter speed, which will cut some light out, and that will give us a darker exposure.
Here we have a typical view through an SLR camera viewfinder. Circled at the bottom is our shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and on the right is our exposure scale, currently indicating that we have the correct exposure. Each marker above and below the midpoint indicates a 1/3 stop exposure change.
That's it. I'm just going to increase that shutter speed, take the same shot again, there we go, and now we can see that one is considerably darker to the last shot. That was the shot before at the correct exposure, and that one's slightly underexposed. Now if I increase the shutter speed even more to a faster shutter speed, we're going to lose even more light, and there we go. Hey presto, even darker that time. That was the one before, and that's the correct exposure. So you can see the changing in exposure by me manually adjusting the shutter speed. Now we can also adjust that exposure level by manually adjusting the aperture as well, because they both work together. When you change one, you can compensate with the other. Now exposure is often described in terms of a one-stop jump in exposure. That's one f-stop brighter or one f-stop darker. And in a little while we're going to show you exactly what that means about a one-stop jump over and underexposed. That's it, great Kirsty.
But first we need to show you how to adjust the shutter speed on your SLR camera by using the camera's main display screen and adjustment dial.
Now if we have a look closely, we can see here I can adjust the shutter speeds quite simply by rotating the dial. You see I'm in manual mode, here's my shutter speeds, and here are the aperture settings. Okay, so I'm changing the shutter speeds to adjust the exposure. Now that's on this pro level SLR camera, but if we take a look at say a more entry level SLR camera, we can do exactly the same thing. Here's the control wheel, and here is showing me the shutter speeds, and there we can see I can change those shutter speeds manually, and that one is the aperture setting. So let's just do a quick test shot on this camera just to prove the point that we can do exactly the same thing even on this entry level SLR. Okay, now we can see from that one, it's not as clear as on the pro level screen, but we can see that the image is slightly overexposed on that particular shot. And we can see that was at 40th of a second shutter speed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop that shutter speed down a little bit faster to 60th of a second to cut a little bit of light out. So let me just change that now to 60th. That's great, Kirsty, keep that there, perfect. And here we can see now we've got the exposure just about right on that preview screen there. Now, to fully understand exposure, you need to understand exposures changing in one-stop jumps. That means doubling the amount of light or halving the amount of light. Now to simplify that, we've prepared some graphics so that make it really easy to understand. So I'm just going to grab those. Okay, here we go. Now if we look at this graphic, we can see a picture that starts off very dark and is gradually getting lighter in exposure. Now if we look at the numbers corresponding here, these are the shutter speeds. Here we see 1,000. If you see 1,000 on your camera, it actually means 1,000th of a second. Then we have 500th, 250th, 125th, all the way down to quarter, half, 1 second, and then even beyond that on most modern cameras. Now, what you'll recognise here is a pattern emerging. You can see that the number is being halved each time. Now, as that shutter speed slows down in these increments, we are doubling the amount of light coming into the camera to be recorded. That doubling of light each time is called a one-stop change. If we go the opposite direction, we're halving the amount of light. That's also called a one-stop exposure change, so it's important to remember that. Now, in the same respect, that happens when we change the aperture values as well. If we look here, starting with f32, we've got a very small hole, very small aperture, only letting a little bit of light through. And then as we go from f32 to f22, we've doubled the amount of light to f16 to f11. So those are also a full one-stop change, doubling the amount of light in that direction, halving the amount of light in that direction. So let's look at that on a camera lens. Here we've got the old Olympus lens with the aperture settings on the lens barrel itself, and you can see here f22, f16, f11, f8, some of the numbers that we just looked at. So let's look at those numbers in relation to what we can see through the lens. So if I put that in position there, we can see that the aperture is fully open, and then as I change it, we're closing the aperture blades down, right down till I get to f22 there, go back to f16, we're doubling the amount of light, to f11, doubling it again, f8, and so on. Now, on modern day digital SLR cameras, it's a little bit different. Those aperture changes are not on the lens barrel as such. Some cameras they still are, but on most of them you'll find them on the display screen. Now earlier we showed you how we can change the shutter speeds here, and you can see that changing on the camera screen there, but here we have the aperture value and we can see f5.6. So what I need to do to change that in manual mode is hold the AV button in and then turn the wheel on the top, and then that lets us change. There we see f8, f11, f16 and f22, and if we look back at our display graphics here, you can see those numbers, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, and that is halving the amount of light in each direction. Now what you would have noticed in that is that the actual numbers, there were extra numbers appearing in between these numbers. Those extra numbers allow us to control the exposure in 1/3 of an f-stop increment, and that's great for extra level of exposure control, but it is still really important to understand exposure changes in double the amount of light or half the amount of light, which are called full f-stop changes. Once you start to learn those full f-stop changes in exposure value, you'll really start to get to grips with this scale and that scale, and it'll start to help your understanding of exposure change much more easily.